What better month to talk about love than February? What does love mean to you? Most people would have probably said romance, romantic love, passion. And honestly, that's very understandable, but you're not like most people, and that's why you're here. What if I was to say there exists many different types of love, and they're both equally as important, and they interact and exist in this thing called the love ecosystem. Hi, I'm Mariah Rambles, and if you're new here, welcome to my channel. Here we overshare and overthink about everything. And if you're not and you're just a regular, welcome back. How's it been since the last video? I kind of missed you. So, for us to discuss this topic, we must first start with a framework. And now we are going to go to our friends, the ancient Greeks, so we can borrow their love framework and apply it to our modern society. I have picked 5 different types of love that I think are crucial for human social development. And they are agape, a selfless love that is pure and unconditional, that connects us to all. This type of love, I would say, is akin to the humanness and empathy that connects us to one another in the grand scheme of things. Obviously, there is also religious people that might say it's akin to godly love as well, but I'm not religious, so I'm sticking to this definition. And then we have Eros. Eros is our world's main character. This is romantic love. It's a passionate and aroused sexual desire and romantic feelings in people. Then there is philia. It is more akin to friendship, or it's a love between equals connected through the mind and through shared past experiences. I find philia to be a little bit funny though, because why can't romance also have the prerequisite of equality? What does that have to say about how we think as romance as a society? But that is not the topic we're discussing here today. That's another day. Anyways, we have storge, which is akin to family. It is a natural bond between family members or those with very powerful relationships between each other. Then we have philotia, which is self-love. Need I say less about philotia? I think we all understand. So, in order for us to better understand this framework, I'm going to have to put this in a more layman example. But before we take it there, I have to first note that in this ecosystem, all these types of love equally interact with each other and affect each other in their own unique ways. This is so much so that if one is prioritized more than the other, it creates more pressure in that one type of love while creating lack in the others. Kind of like an opportunity cost for those who are familiar with economics. In the mainstream, a very common terminology that reflects this love ecosystem is mommy and daddy issues. We are all familiar with the idea that when your familial relations are a little bit complicated, it can also complicate the nature in which you approach romance. We can also say the same for friends, which is also in mainstream thought, that you are who you surround yourselves with, and your friends can either make or break you. However, we fail to also connect that all of these types of love are affecting each other at the same time. We can just take mommy and daddy issues and just replace it with self-love. If a person has a self-love problem, probably it will also affect how they affect their friends and how they affect their partners. If a person has a mommy and daddy problem, it will affect how they find friends. It might even affect agape. It might affect their self-love. If a person has an issue with empathy as a whole, like sociopaths or psychopaths, it will also affect the other relationships in their life. We can all understand this. So how then can we benefit from this sort of structure? I think that the modern world is going through a love imbalance problem. And honestly, it could be a problem that's been beyond our modernity. And honestly, I only live in the modern world, so I'm only going based on what I see among most things. But in order for us to tackle this problem, I would like to highlight a quote from one of my favorite YouTubers, Tara Mukni, where 3 years ago she made a video called amatonormativity that started this whole thought process in my head. Amatonormativity is the expectation for people to only pursue romance and not other forms of relationships, such as platonic relations. And in that video, she quoted a book by Carrie Jenkins on what love is and what it could be, where she said, often in songs and everywhere else, people say love when what they mean is romantic love. That is a convenient shorthand, but notice how it also suggests that romantic love has accorded a special place in our thinking. And accorded a special place in our thinking, it has. Just look at the music, look at the movies, look at the literature, look at the law, look at the framework of our society. If you think about some of the most popular literature and movies and music, it's always talking about love or sexual relations. It's all Eros. And then when you think about how it structures our government, there is so much incentive for people to be coupled up and people to be in more married heterosexual relations, right? So you think about housing and how in a lot of cases it is much more easier to get a house when it's 2 people rather than 1. You think about going to the hospital. Why can't I call a friend to be a person that checks up for me in certain hospitals? You know, you think about things like marital benefits in taxes. You can get marital write-offs from taxes sometimes. You think about how government incentives in certain countries will literally give stipends for people who are having children. And I understand the argument. As a organism, as humans, as Homo sapiens, right? It has been, like other organisms, our best interest to populate. Other organisms reproduce and populate, so do Homo sapiens, so do us humans, right? However, I can go and say that it is also the fact that humans formed society, formed communities. It is because we banded together and formed other relationships outside of our more sexual and erotic relations that we were able to surpass catastrophes that were beyond us in capacity, and we were able to attack and conquer animals that were much bigger and faster and better than us in all physical capabilities. Yet for some reason, our society mostly focuses on romance, on marriage, on sex. It is even so much so that people will tolerate horrible behavior from their romantic partners that they wouldn't otherwise tolerate from their friends, from their families, or other people and other relations they have in their personal lives. I think this sort of dynamic creates a pressure on the romantic partner to fulfill the gaps that are missing in the love ecosystem. When you put all of your social depth into a romantic partner, it doesn't matter how much they love you, it will never be enough because you're asking them to fit in shoes that are bigger than them. The same applies for us single people who cannot get romantic love, so we start focusing on ourselves. We can love ourselves all we want and try to understand and push that energy inwards and even protect our peace so much so that we have no one to share it with. But at the end of the day, the burden of the ecosystem only lies with us alone, leaving us struggling at the weight of it. So this hyper-prioritization of some relationships over others creates a pressure in one direction and a lack in the other direction. And at the end of it, it leaves us very unsatisfied no matter how hard we try to approach either one of those relationships with as much effort as we can, because ultimately we're dealing with something beyond just that one relation. So for us to understand the benefits of this framework, we must first understand the consequences of a love imbalance in the ecosystem. And what better way to describe this than the loneliness epidemic? Notice how I said loneliness epidemic and not male loneliness epidemic, because I believe that the epidemic is faced by all of us. For this conversation, I'm going to be focusing on binary men and women, not really everything in between, but I think it still applies. Why is it that despite all of us going through a romantic loneliness epidemic, one gender is feeling the brunt of it more and has become the focus point? What is unique about male loneliness? I would say this is a very good example of the male love ecosystem imbalance. Because when you think about how men and women are socialized to approach relationships, men are left a lot more isolated than women. Women are socialized to maintain relationships with everyone within their community, from their family to their peers and to other people who might be very different from them. Whereas men are only taught to be vulnerable to themselves, if even allowed that at all. Women are more likely to form socially vibrant relationships with their friends. They're more likely to maintain close relations with their family members and are more likely to participate in self-love through therapy, self-care, and journaling and other forms of self-care. But men, on the other hand, are only told to look at, socializing by themselves. And I think that is a very lonely way to live life. I often tell people, it doesn't matter what timeline I'm born into, I would hate to be born a man because of how lonely it is to only be allowed yourself that gets to see a vulnerable part of your experience. Sorry guys, I had a little bit of a technical problem. It seems my iPhone is out of storage. As I was saying, women are more likely to develop stronger social relationships with other people outside of their romantic relationships in comparison to men, which only further isolates them. So even though we are all feeling this sort of romantic loneliness, and we're also feeling it in addition to the pressure that society puts on us to develop romantic relations up until marriage, men are further isolated because they cannot diversify their loneliness towards other relationships in the ecosystem. Women have a much easier time because it's harder to focus on your crippling romantic loneliness when you have a vibrant social life, when you have friends to talk about, you love yourself and you're vulnerable with yourself, and you have family that can embrace you and baby you and make you feel loved. So romantic love stops being a priority. Whereas for men, whereas for men, it seems that the only time they can have any sort of intimate social interaction is within the confines of a romantic relationship with their partner. And that is why there is a quote unquote hyper focus on the there is a quote unquote hyper focus on the male loneliness epidemic. So what are the benefits of a love ecosystem, or being aware of a love ecosystem? I think it makes you approach your relationships in a more holistic, balanced, and harmonious way, as you now get to realize how important other aspects of, community are in your life. You're able to approach your romantic relationships not from a place of desperation and pressure, but from a place of mutual interest, from a place of mutual understanding. And you're also more likely to take the time because the pressure is eased off a bit. You're more likely to approach your friendships and even family relations a lot more better. And you're even more likely to approach your self-love a lot better when everything is balanced. And as I mentioned earlier, not everyone is as privileged to have strong family ties. Some people are born with amazing parents that show up for them emotionally, and they're able to have this emotionally vivid technically it is a romance because love is always a romance, but emotionally vivid relationships with their family, but the other people who do not have that and have to learn how to diversify it somewhere else. But all in all, it does allow you to approach it a lot more holistically. I grew up as a person that has always questioned relationships, my relationships to people, and people in relationship to me. And I've always felt as if my love was too much because I was always trying to focus all of my love assets into one basket, if I must get financial for a second. Like, I think I've only ever had one love at a time up until recently. And for the most part of my life, it was my friends. And they had to carry the burden of the lack that I had in other forms of my relationships, whether it was with my family or romantic or self-love, because I used to hate and loathe myself back then. And because of that, I was always showing up to my friends with just so much that they couldn't handle that, and they were trying to handle because they loved me at the time, but it was so much. And to be honest, I had tolerated horrible relationships with people too, because I was desperate and I was lonely and I couldn't bear having to start the process of finding my own people again, even though they would be better people this time. But it was just so lonely and so, I don't know how to express it really, but it is because of that I found myself in a lot of negative relationships. And it's why I feel convicted to share this. And again, this idea, this problem, this concept might not be a new one, but I've never heard anyone talk about love as referring to it as an ecosystem other than the Greeks, who were talking about the different types of love that exists, because at the end of the day, maybe it's because we are one track minded as a species, or again, the financial incentives for governments to push out like media that encourages people to, well, make babies and make the future workforce for the GDP, or whatever the case. I think it is in learning how to balance my relationships with people and cultivating good relationships with my family, good relationships with my friends, good relationships with nature, good relationships with myself, and in the future, if I have a romantic partner, good relationships with them too, I guess. But it is in doing that I'm able to approach love with a sort of peace. And yes, love can be passionate, but if you're putting all that passion into one aspect of the ecosystem, you're going to set it on fire and they're going to burn alive. And not like set on fire in a romantic way, but they're going to burn alive. There is a romance in all forms of love. And I feel love deeply everywhere, that sometimes it's hard to discuss which of the loves in my life I prioritize. At the end of the day, whenever people come and ask me, or we have these conversations of, oh, you're not going to feel the same when you have a romantic partner, or, oh, you're not going to feel the same when you're married, I'm just like, I do not want to lose the love that I've cultivated in all the other aspects of my life, because they've allowed me so much safety in that regard. And I think all of us should approach love in this sort of understanding that it's not just romantic love that is a priority, but there's other ways to love that are equally important and equally it affects each other equally, and the neglect of one over the other, or the prioritizing of one over the other, just leaves us alone, yeah.